How we doing? A good vach, Shavua Tov. It's Saturday night in Los Angeles. We've come out of Shabbos. We are holding in volume 2 of the Talmud, Shabbos. We're in chapter 3. We're learning about the laws and restrictions on cooking on Shabbos. And we're going to be skipping over Mishnah 4 very quickly, and we're going to be looking at Mishnahs 5 and 6. How are we doing? Who's in the house? Where are we tuning in from? Who's going to be the nearest? Who's going to be the farthest? Let us know what city you're in. Timothy James Wheeler says, good. I like that. Where you are is good. Ed Berg is in from Galloway, New Jersey. Great to see you, Ed, as always. This is going to be a good class. I can feel it. A good show. I can feel it. I'm going to share a quick idea for the coming week, and I think I might even write a little article about this. The new Parsha, the new Torah portion for this week, it's a double. It's actually Tazria Mitzora. Okay, Tazria Mitzora. And in Tazria, we're actually learning the laws of Tzara'as. We've talked about it several times here. Tzara'as is often translated badly as leprosy. It was not leprosy. It's a disease that no longer exists. But it was a physical manifestation of a spiritual problem. And we were only cursed with it, as it were. We were only affected by this kind of painful and embarrassing skin disease in ancient times when the temple stood. As a nation, we're no longer at that high and holy level, so we actually don't get this problem now. But when we did, it would be an outbreak on the skin, which would have to be examined by a priest, and then you go through a process of purification, and then you work your way back into the community. While you have it, you would have to quarantine yourself. And there used to be an erroneous but widespread biblical interpretation of the laws of Tzara'as, where people thought that, well, it was leprosy, it was a plague, it was a disease, and the person who had it would be quarantined so that other people wouldn't get it. This way of thinking, that was not the way our sages held, and it was emphatically disproven by Rabbi Raphael Shimshon Hirsch. Raphael Shimshon Hirsch, Rabbi Hirsch, who showed that because this was a physical manifestation of a spiritual malady, which was closely associated with the sins of slander, which is a type of lashon hara, evil tongue, speaking badly of other people, as well as robbery and sexual immorality, and a few other ways of hurting other people. Lashon hara principally, but also these other ways of hurting people. And so what Rabbi Hirsch taught is that these things would erupt on your skin when you had come to take other people for granted, right? You didn't care about their needs or feelings. You just cared about yourself and the way you could entertain your friends and have something to say or get what you want at the expense of others. And when you lost touch, when you stopped caring about other people, their pain and what they feel, then you'd be struck with this condition, and then you would have to quarantine yourself. And the result of a quarantine is that you would lose contact with other people. The contact, the importance of it, you had come to take for granted as you took other people for granted, right? So it was actually a blessing that because you had slipped into this state of not caring about others, that you'd be struck with this disease. It would be an eruption on the skin. A priest would have to come and look at you and say, what's wrong with this person? You'd be quarantined, separated from others, and given some time to think about the fact that your behavior had caused harm to others. And so during that quarantine period, you had a spiritual, emotional, and hopefully behavioral reset. And what a lesson that is for our time. This quarantine that we're all in, what a marvelous opportunity now that we've lost something that we didn't even realize how precious it was. The opportunity to be with other people, the ability to assemble with our friends and with our the other fans, right? At music shows and sports shows and in movies and in restaurants, to be with others, to be in assemblies of our families, to have big seders. We took that stuff for granted. And now that it's been deprived from us, what a good time to examine our deeds, just like the person who suffered from tsaras in ancient Israel. What an opportunity this is. Hello, my friends. It's good to be with you on AT Daily. As I mentioned before, we are holding on page 42 of Tractate Shabbos. We are in chapter 3. We're going to very quickly pass by, and then, by the way, we'll count the Omer. So if you haven't counted the Omer, stick with us. We'll count the Omer at the end of tonight's class. But while we're here, okay, so we're going to skip quickly over the fourth Mishnah of chapter 3, which was very specific. It was kind of about urns, coffee urns, soup urns, warming devices that they had in Talmudic times. And they actually found them in Pompeii, right? So Pompeii was a Roman city. It was sort of like the Roman, Acapulco. It was where the rich people went, like the Caribbean, right? For rich Romans. It was their vacation spot in I guess, southern Italy is where Pompeii is. And then, there was a volcano, I think it was called Mount Etna, that, just went in, or Mount Vesuvius? I'm sorry, I'm not sure. But it was a huge volcano that destroyed, absolutely buried these people, the rich people, in their vacation homes. And because they were buried, so much of that world is preserved, and we actually know what these things look like that are being described by our sages in the fourth Mishnah. But we don't really use those same kind of urns now, so if you want to take a look at the fourth Mishnah, you should. The fifth Mishnah says that we may not empty an urn that we use, right? So a vessel that we use to boil hot water, right? Before Shabbos. So we use it to boil the hot water. And now we've got hot water, right? For the rest of Shabbos. And the vessel itself, the iron pot, probably got nice and hot. So the question was, well, could we pour out that water, which is hot, right? We got a certain amount of hot water, and then pour cold water into the urn, which remains hot and would then heat up the water. Sounds, on its face, totally prohibited because you'd be heating water on Shabbos. However, we've already learned that to warm water on Shabbos is something you can do. So the question is, when you're gonna put cold water into this hot vessel, how much will it be heated up? If it has the possibility of heating up that water to the point where you would recoil, you would touch it and recoil because it's so hot, then for sure you can't do it. But if all that's going to happen is it's going to get warm, right? It's just going to warm the water. It's not going to cook it, meaning boil it, right? So it's not going to boil the water. It's just going to warm it. So yeah, then you can do it. As we know, you can put something on a blech, right, during Shabbat, which is like a hot plate, a warming tray, and there might be some food with some liquid sauce on it. That sauce is going to get warm, but it's not going to come to cook because it was already cooked before Shabbos. It's just going to get warm, and that is okay. What about putting cold water into hot water? Can you do that? The cold water will certainly get heated up in the hot water, but will it get to the super hot temperature? If so, then we can't do it. If not, right? So if it's a lot of hot water, to pour a little bit of cold water into it is definitely going to be prohibited because that little bit of cold water is going to get the temperature of all the water around it, right? But if you've got some hot water and a fair amount of cold water and you're going to mix them and just make, a bunch of warm water less hot than the hot water was, then that is going to be okay. And we're actually going to come back to hot into cold and cold into hot in a moment. Another issue, however, that comes up is now, remember that we had this idea that you heated up water really hot before Shabbos, and then you just let that heat there, right? It was maybe insulated in some way. The vessel remained hot. And then you emptied it of its water. And the question was, can we put water in? Right? So one problem is, well, if that water is going to get hot enough that you recall from the touch, well, then you've heated water on Shabbos, so we can't do it. A separate objection is raised that if you have a piece of metal that is very, very hot and you add water to it, that is actually the last step of creating a metal vessel, right? You can have a picture in your mind. You maybe seen like Robin Hood movies or movies where they're beating a sword, right? And the blacksmith is hammering that red hot metal, and then what's the last thing that he does? He sticks it in the water, right? And it takes the heat away. And what does it do? It tempers the steel, right? It hardens the steel. So this idea that you would take a very hot piece of metal and add cold water to it, well, isn't that violating the prohibited melacha, the prohibited labor on Shabbos of finishing the creation of a metal object? It's blacksmithing, and it's blacksmithing is prohibited, and it's like striking the final blow, which in itself, finishing something that was not finished before, could this be considered finishing? Well, now the question becomes, why did you do it, right? If for some reason it was a red hot sword, it was red hot, and then Shabbat came in, and then you put it in water to finish creating that sword and to harden that metal, everyone agrees. Obviously, you cannot do that. That is prohibited on Shabbos. But if metal was hot, okay, and let's say it was very hot, the vessel was very hot, but you're gonna pour a bunch of cold water into it. So for sure, the water that you add to that very hot vessel, because there's enough of it, the group of the water, all the water as a whole, taken as a whole, is not gonna get so hot that we're gonna recoil to the touch, right? The water won't heat up that much, so it's permitted in terms of not heating water, not cooking water, as it were, on Shabbos. But what about this problem that you might be tempering the metal, that you might be causing this hot metal to become harder by suddenly cooling it by putting a bunch of cold water on it? So to understand whether that's prohibited or not, we come back to the conflict that keeps coming up in Tractate Shabbos, the dispute between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda, right? Because Rabbi Shimon says, why did you put that water in there? To do the permitted labor of warming water on Shabbos. The fact that that steel might become harder and itself be a prohibited labor of tempering steel, but you didn't do it intentionally. Your intent was just to warm the water so that you could drink it. The unintended consequence was that the steel might have become hard. Since that was not your intention and it was not inevitable, it maybe got harder, maybe it didn't, you're not sure, you don't know, you're not a blacksmith, no one's told you that for sure the steel got harder, so you can do it. According to Rabbi Shimon, it's permitted because the unintended consequence of a permitted labor, the unintended prohibited labor, that's a consequence of the permitted labor, is permitted. You're permitted to do the permitted labor even though you might have that unintended consequence which is prohibited. According to Rabbi Yehuda, no. The fact that you might have created that prohibited labor, it happened as a result of your permitted act, of doing what you thought was a permitted action, right? Warming the water is permitted, but the fact that you caused that metal to be hardened, even though it wasn't your intention, you're still going to be liable to bring a sin offering. This activity is prohibited per Rav Yehuda. Okay, so then we come back, and now that we understand that it's permitted per Rabbi Shimon and prohibited per Rabbi Yehuda, then we have to understand the distinction that Shmuel is going to make when we have an unintentional act versus a labor that was not intended for its own sake. There's a difference between an unintentional act and a labor not for its own sake. Where does this come up? Imagine, if you will, that we were near the blacksmith shop, right? And he was heating up a sword. This piece of metal was left in the coal furnace, and he got some, terrible or important or urgent news, and he ran off. He ran off and forgot about that sword that was heating up. It heated. Something shifted, and that hot metal sort of fell on the ground. And where did it fall? Let's say this was like a very small blacksmith stall, right, near a public thoroughfare, and that hot piece of metal fell off his workbench and onto a path where people walk by. Now you've got metal, let's say it's even white hot metal, that a person might come to step on. A person might come to step on that metal. Okay, can you extinguish that? Can you pick up that sword and stick it in water? Now, the reason you're doing it is not to finish the blacksmith's job of hardening the sword. The reason you're going to stick that white hot sword into water is for the public safety, right? Your labor, in this prohibited labor that you're going to do of sticking the sword in the water, you're not doing it for the sake of the sword, you're doing it for the sake of the public safety. So this is a labor not for its own sake. That is different than an unintentional labor, right? For example, if you're playing catch, right, with your son on Friday night, and somebody has a motion light, right? And so, like you guys are just playing catch, and then you throw the ball a little further, and your son backs up to catch the ball, and he walks into the zone where there's a motion detector and a light goes on. If he dropped the ball and he wasn't sure where it was, so he stepped into that zone on purpose to find the ball, then he turned the light on intentionally. But if he simply was just backing up to catch the ball, not thinking about it, and the light went on, so that was unintentional. That was not an act. So an unintentional act is very different than a labor not for its own sake. And Shmuel teaches us that if you perform an unintentional act, he holds like Rabbi Shimon. That was an unintended consequence. The person is exempt from bringing a sin offering. But if you perform a labor not for its own sake, you did the action intentionally, you knew that you were going to perform a prohibited labor, even though you weren't doing it in order to get the benefit of that labor, but rather for something that was permitted, like the public safety, in that case, he would hold like Rabbi Yehuda, right? So now in the case of the red hot sword, though, because safety is so important, everyone will agree that you need to get that sword out of the street. But the question is, how are you going to do it, right? So for example, let's say that on that path, it was next to a lake. There was like a pond nearby. So you could kick it, right? Or let's say you took a stick and just shoved it, right? Just shoved it to the side toward the pond. You didn't want it to go in the pond. You just wanted to go toward the pond, just to get it off the path. That's permitted, just to move it off the path. If it happens to fall in the pond, that would be unintentional, and then that would be exempt, right, for everybody. But if you just throw it into the pond, yeah, so maybe you could have found a better way to ensure the public safety in that situation. The difference between an unintentional act and a labor not for its own sake. Whew. Okay. All right. Going back to this idea of hot into cold or cold into hot. So now we have to distinguish between a primary vessel and a secondary vessel. So like an urn, a Shabbos urn that we have inside, and it looks like this large thermos, and we put water into it on Friday afternoon, and it heats it to the boiling point, and then just automatically keeps it at that temperature. It was already cooked, and now it's just maintaining its temperature during Shabbos. We can pump water out of it, and the water will stay hot all during Shabbos. The pump is a mechanical pump. It actually has an electric dispenser, which we cannot use during Shabbos, right? Which comes out faster and smoother with less effort. On Shabbos, we have to use that pump, which doesn't use an electric motor or turn on a little light, right? So it just pumps the water out. It stays hot. Can we add water? Let's say we had a lot of people wanting to use hot water during Shabbat to make tea and coffee, which we'll talk about in a moment. Can we put more water into that urn because we were running out? No, we cannot, because that new water that we would be adding during Shabbos would be added into a primary vessel, which has the capacity to heat up that water to a temperature that you would recoil from the touch. So we cannot add water to that primary vessel. But after the water in the urn goes into another container, whether it's a pitcher or a cup, now, even though that water, when it just came out of the urn, is very hot, it's now in a secondary vessel, right? Not the vessel that was used to heat it up originally, but just another vessel that doesn't have the capacity to add heat in the same way. It's a vessel that by definition can't cook the water, or we couldn't put water into it on Shabbos. From a secondary vessel, we have a lot more freedom. And this is why if you're going to make a cup of tea on Shabbos, you don't hold a cup with the tea bag right under the Shabbos urn, because now water would be coming from where? From the primary vessel, full temperature, right onto the tea bag, right? So it's not, so now which is like cooking. And to make sure that you're not going to be cooking and preparing a new dish on Shabbos, what we do is we receive that water into another vessel. We like to use a 2-cup measuring cup. And then from that vessel, we can have a teacup with a tea bag into it. And we pour from the secondary vessel into the third vessel, right, which is where the tea is going to be made. Why? Because by definition, once you're into a secondary vessel, it can't be that hot. Right? And you can't possibly be cooking when you create the tea. You're creating a mixture, for which we have an exemption on Shabbos because it's not cooking. It's just using warm water. You can't brew tea. That would be different. You can't boil water on a kettle in order to create the tea. But you can take this warm water and make a warm mixture. And that is okay on Shabbos. That's our discussion of Mishnah number 5. Mishnah number 6, we're just going to mention briefly, is that the question is, can you add spice to a stew that you have made that is cooking on Shabbos? Right? So there's actually, believe it or not, a little bit of a dispute here. Some say that you cannot add spices to the pot in which the stew cooked, right? The cholent keeps cooking during Shabbos, which is like a stew in a slow cooker. But you can't add spice to it during Shabbos. The idea is it's just staying warm and taste changes a little, okay. But really you did the cooking on Friday. If you add spices to the primary vessel in which the stew is cooking, then you are violating the prohibition of cooking on Shabbos. But if you take from the crock pot or from the slow cooker, from the Le Creuset that you had in the oven, wherever you made your cholent, and you take some of that cholent into a serving bowl that you're going to put on the table, and people are going to take from there, you can add spice in the individual bowls, and you can add spice into the serving bowl on Shabbos, but you can't add spice into the primary vessel, the original cooking pot. Some say you can add into the primary vessel if it's no longer so hot that you would recoil if you touched it, right? If it's not that hot, then you're not really changing the flavor. You're just making a mixture on Shabbos. You're not cooking on Shabbos. But most say you can add spice to the primary vessel even if it's not that hot, because it's the primary vessel, the one in which the cooking happened and has happened. And so we don't want to even come close to cooking on Shabbos. That's what I've got for us today. Let us count the Omer, and then I will check the comments to see if there are any questions about what we've covered today. I am prepared and ready to fulfill the positive commandment of counting the Omer. As is written in the Torah, you shall count 7 complete weeks from the day following the Passover rest day, when you brought the Omer as a wave offering, to the day after the 7th week. You shall count 50 days. Then you shall present a meal offering of new grain to the Lord. May the pleasantness of the Lord our God be upon us. Establish for us the work of our hands. Establish the work of our hands. I'll say the blessing first in English and then in Hebrew. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has made us holy through his commandments and has commanded us about counting the Omer. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu al sefiras haomer. Today is the 10th day, making 1 week and 3 days of the Omer. Lord our God in heaven, may it be your will to strengthen me and to help me correct any blemish which I have caused in the Sephira Tiferes Shebegevura. Please help me correct any blemish that I have made in the Sephira of the harmony of restraint. The harmony of restraint. And as I examine the behavior that I'm trying to break free from during this period of the Omer, the Pharaoh that I cried out to God to help me to free myself of. And every day I look at a different aspect of my own destructive habit that I'm trying to change. And today I ask, what is the harmony or the balance point of the judgment or restraint aspect in my breaking free, in my exodus from my self-destructive behavior, right? Gevura means strength, judgment, restraint. So I have to curb my behavior in a certain way. And if I imagine using harmony and balance to do that, I can start to see a new vision of myself as I break free of that behavior with God's help. Please, God, help me to do that. And may all of you have success in making the change that you're trying to make during this period of the Omer. We say, Amen. Okay. Janice Beanstock says, thank you, Sal. Shavua Tov, a good vach to you. Beautiful, beautiful. Still liable for the activity. I think, Timothy, you must have been addressed to something I said earlier. Andrew says the leprosy subject was interesting, isn't that? So that's this week's Torah portion, Tazria. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the class, we think about the fact that people were quarantined when they had Tzara'as, right? Not because they had a contagious disease, but because they had performed, they had violated the prohibition on Lashon Hara, right? Slander, robbery, sexual immorality, other things that show that they didn't care about other people. Then they had to quarantine themselves and have no contact with people to have that spiritual, emotional, and hopefully behavioral reset. And what an opportunity we have now as we are separated from people and we miss being with people and we realize that we were taking people for granted. And now we can ask ourselves, how could we do better in taking other people's feelings and harm into account and do better for ourselves as individuals and as a society? My friends, it's been great to learn with you. I'm sending you big love from Los Angeles. All the best and a good week, Shavua Tov, to all of you.